1904 studio photo discovered, and experts freeze when they realize what the child is holding. The leather-bound photograph album arrived at the Philadelphia Genealogical Society on a humid morning in June 2024, part of a estate donation from a woman named Patricia Brennan, who had died at age 92. Her attorney had shipped 3 boxes of family documents, explaining that Mrs. Brennan had been the last surviving member of her family line and had left instructions for her genealogical materials to be preserved for historical research. David Park, the Society's senior researcher and photographic analyst, carefully opened the album's cracked leather cover. The pages were brittle, the black paper flaking at the edges, but the photographs mounted on them remained remarkably clear. Most were typical examples of early 20th century family photography: stern-faced ancestors in formal dress, children posed stiffly beside potted plants, couples on their wedding days. He was cataloging the images systematically, noting dates and identifying marks when he reached page 17. The photograph mounted there made him pause, not because it was unusual in composition, but because something about it felt immediately wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The image showed a formal family portrait taken in a professional studio, dated 1904 according to the photographer's embossed mark at the bottom. Morrison & Webb Photography, Philadelphia, PA. 7 people were arranged in the traditional pyramid composition common to the era. A middle-aged couple seated in the center, surrounded by 4 children of varying ages, and an elderly woman standing slightly behind them. The father sat rigidly upright, his expression severe, one hand resting on the shoulder of the oldest boy who stood beside him. The mother, equally rigid in her high-collared dress, held an infant in her lap. 2 other children, boys of perhaps 8 and 10 years old, flanked the parents. And standing slightly to the left, looking small and uncomfortable, was a girl of approximately 5 years old. David leaned closer, studying the composition. The family appeared prosperous. Their clothing was well made, the studio backdrop expensive, the photographer clearly skilled. But there was something about the positioning that bothered him. The 4 boys were clearly connected to the parents through posture and proximity, but the little girl stood apart, her body angled slightly away from the group, her expression different from the others. Where the rest of the family displayed the typical Victorian stoicism, the girl's face showed something else. Fear, perhaps, or deep sadness. Her eyes, even in the faded sepia tones, seemed to plead with whoever looked at the photograph, and her hands, clasped tightly at her waist, held something small and white that was partially visible between her fingers. David reached for his magnifying glass, his professional curiosity fully engaged now. As he examined the image more closely, his breath caught in his throat. The girl was holding a piece of paper, folded small and clutched desperately in her small hands. And on the visible edge of that paper, he could see writing. Faint, cramped letters that seemed to have been written by a child. David immediately transferred the photograph to the Society's digital imaging laboratory, a small room equipped with high-resolution scanners and computer enhancement software. He had worked with degraded historical photographs for 15 years, using modern technology to reveal details invisible to the naked eye, but he had never felt the urgency he experienced now. Something about the little girl's expression haunted him. The desperate grip on that small piece of paper, the isolation in her body language, the fear in her eyes, it all suggested a story far darker than a simple family portrait. He placed the photograph on the flatbed scanner and ran it through at maximum resolution, creating a digital file with enough detail to examine individual fibers of the paper and threads of fabric. Then he opened the image in professional enhancement software and began the painstaking process of isolating and clarifying the area where the girl's hands clutched the mysterious note. The first enhancement revealed that the paper was definitely handwritten, not printed. The letters were shaky and uneven, suggesting they had been written by someone young or inexperienced, or perhaps written quickly under stress. David zoomed in further, adjusting contrast and brightness levels, filtering out the noise and degradation from 120 years of aging. Slowly, laboriously, letters began to emerge from the digital fog. He could see HEL clearly now, and what looked like the letter P following it. His hands trembled slightly as he refined the image further. The full word came into focus. Help. Help me, David whispered to the empty laboratory. She was asking for help. He continued working on the image, spending the next 3 hours isolating every visible portion of the paper. The note had been folded to hide most of its contents, but along the edges, fragments of other words appeared, what looked like please and what might be take or home. And at the very bottom edge, barely visible where the girl's thumb pressed against the paper, he found something that made his blood run cold: a partial address. The numbers 1247 were clearly visible, and below them, fragments of what appeared to be chess and St. David sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just a family photograph. This was a desperate plea for help, hidden in plain sight, preserved for 120 years in an album that had passed through generations until finally reaching his laboratory. But who was this child? Why was she holding a note asking for help during what should have been a routine family portrait? And why had no one noticed it before? He pulled up the estate documents from Patricia Brennan's donation. According to the genealogical notes she had included, the album had belonged to her grandmother, Catherine Morrison, who had died in 1956. The photographs were primarily of the Morrison family and their relatives from the late 1800s and early 1900s. David cross-referenced the photographer's mark with historical business directories and found Morrison & Webb Photography listed at 412 Market Street, Philadelphia, operating from 1898 to 1919. They had been a successful studio serving middle and upper-class families, but knowing the photographer didn't tell him who the family in the portrait was or who the little girl pleading for help had been. David spent the rest of that day creating the highest quality digital copies possible of the photograph, documenting every detail he could extract. He printed a large format version and pinned it to his office wall, studying it obsessively, trying to understand what he was seeing. The family clearly had money. The father's suit was well-tailored, probably custom-made. The mother's dress showed expensive fabric and elaborate detailing. The children wore clothing that indicated prosperity: clean, well-fitted, made from quality materials. Even the studio setting spoke of wealth. The backdrop was hand-painted, the furniture genuine antiques, not stage props. But the little girl's dress, while clean and presentable, was noticeably simpler than what the boys wore. The fabric appeared cheaper, the cut less refined, and unlike the other children, she wore no jewelry, no decorative elements, nothing that suggested she was treasured as part of this prosperous family. David's colleague, Margaret Chen, stopped by his office late that afternoon and found him still staring at the image. "You've been in here for 8 hours," she observed. "What's so fascinating about this photograph?" David gestured for her to come closer and showed her the enhanced digital images revealing the note in the girl's hands. Margaret, who specialized in social history and women's studies, went pale as she read the visible fragments. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This is a child asking for help during a family photograph session. David, this could be evidence of—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Of something terrible." "I know," David said quietly. "The question is, what happened to her? And why was she with this family if she was desperate enough to hide a note asking for help?" Margaret pulled up a chair and studied the image carefully. "Look at the positioning again. The 4 boys are clearly the family's biological children. They all share similar features with the parents. But this girl looks different. Her coloring is darker, her facial structure distinct. She could be from a different ethnic background entirely." David hadn't noticed that before, but Margaret was right. In the sepia tones, it was subtle, but the girl's features did suggest she might have Southern European or possibly Mediterranean ancestry, while the rest of the family appeared Northern European. "Could she be a servant's child?" David suggested. "Maybe photographed with the family as a courtesy?" "No," Margaret shook her head firmly. "Servant children were never included in formal family portraits in 1904. The class divisions were too rigid. If she's in this photograph, they wanted her to appear as part of the family. But her body language, her expression, everything about her positioning suggests she didn't want to be there." They sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the implications. "We need to identify this family," David finally said, "and we need to find out who this child was and what happened to her." David and Margaret spent the next 2 days researching the Morrison family, working backward from Patricia Brennan through her grandmother Catherine. City directories, census records, and genealogical databases slowly revealed the family tree. Catherine Morrison had been born in 1891 to John Morrison and his wife Elizabeth. John Morrison was listed in the 1900 census as a wholesale merchant, living at a prestigious address on Rittenhouse Square. The family was clearly wealthy and socially prominent, but the census records didn't match the photograph. The 1900 census listed John and Elizabeth Morrison with only 2 children, Catherine, age 9, and her brother William, age 7. But the photograph showed 4 boys and 1 girl, taken in 1904 when Catherine would have been 13. too old to be any of the children in the image. This isn't Catherine's immediate family, Margaret realized. The album must have included photographs from extended family members, too. They expanded their search, looking for Morrison relatives who fit the demographic profile, a couple with 4 sons living in Philadelphia around 1904. After hours of cross-referencing census records, city directories, and church registries, they found a match. Edward Morrison, John Morrison's younger brother, was listed in the 1900 census, living at 1834 Spruce Street with his wife Clara and their 4 sons: Edward Jr., age 12, Robert, age 10, James, age 8, and Thomas, age 2. By 1904, the family composition would match the photograph almost perfectly. "So we've identified the family," David said. "Edward and Clara Morrison with their 4 sons. But who is the little girl?" Margaret pulled up the 1910 census for the Morrison household and gasped. Listed under the Edward Morrison family was an entry that made David's blood run cold. Maria Rossi, female, age 11, relation to head of household, adopted daughter, birthplace, Italy. An adopted daughter, Italian. Approximately the right age if she had been 5 in 1904. But the census record raised more questions than it answered. If Maria had been formally adopted by the Morrisons, why did she look so terrified in the photograph? Why was she holding a note begging for help? David immediately began searching for records related to Maria Rossi and the Morrison family adoption. What he found in the Philadelphia County Court archives made him feel physically ill. There were no legal adoption papers for Maria Rossi, no formal proceedings, no court approval, nothing that would indicate a legitimate adoption had taken place. The child had simply appeared in the Morrison household sometime between 1903 and 1904, and the family had listed her as adopted in subsequent census records, without any legal documentation to support the claim. "This wasn't an adoption," Margaret said quietly, reading the records over David's shoulder. "This was something else entirely." Margaret suggested they search historical newspaper archives for any mention of missing children in Philadelphia around 1903-1904, particularly Italian children. David accessed the Library of Congress's digitized newspaper collection and began the tedious process of searching through fragmented, poorly scanned pages from Philadelphia's Italian-language newspapers of the period. What they discovered was heartbreaking and far more common than David had imagined. The early 1900s had seen massive Italian immigration to Philadelphia, with thousands of poor families arriving from southern Italy seeking work. These immigrants lived in cramped tenements in South Philadelphia, working in factories, construction, and domestic service. And their children, particularly young girls, frequently disappeared. David found dozens of notices in Il Progresso Italo-Americano and L'Opinione, Italian-language newspapers, reporting missing children. Most were brief, desperate pleas from parents. Missing: Giovanna Russo, age 6, last seen near Christian Street Market. Please contact her father Antonio Russo at Lost. Carlo Marino, age 4, disappeared from our home on Montrose Street. Reward offered. But what struck David most was how many of these cases were never resolved, never followed up in later editions. The children simply vanished, and their working-class immigrant parents had no resources, no social standing, no access to police who might actually investigate. Margaret found academic research on the period that provided context. Several historical studies documented what was euphemistically called informal adoption in early 20th century America. Wealthy families taking poor immigrant children, supposedly to give them better lives, but often treating them as unpaid servants or cheap labor. Some of these arrangements were genuinely charitable, but many were exploitative or worse, and the line between adoption and human trafficking was often invisible. "We need to find out if there are any records of a Maria Rossi going missing around 1903, David said. They searched for weeks, combing through Italian-language newspapers, church records from South Philadelphia's Italian parishes, and immigration documents. Finally, in a June 1903 edition of L'Opinione, Margaret found a small notice that made her hands shake. Missing: Maria Rossi, age 5 years, disappeared from family home at 1247 Chester Street on June 8th. Last seen playing outside our building. She has dark hair, brown eyes, wearing blue dress. Her mother and father are desperate. If anyone has seen our daughter, please contact Giuseppe Rossi or Father Antonio at St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi Church. We beg for any information." David stared at the address, 1247 Chester Street, the same partial address visible on the note clutched in the little girl's hand in the photograph. "She was trying to tell someone where she came from," he whispered. "She was trying to give them her real address so they could take her home." Armed with names and an address, David and Margaret dove into researching the Rossi family. Immigration records showed Giuseppe Rossi and his wife Francesca arriving at Ellis Island in 1897 from a small village near Naples. Their daughter Maria had been born in Philadelphia in 1898, making her 5 years old in 1903 when she disappeared. Giuseppe worked as a laborer in a textile factory. Francesca took in piecework sewing at home, stitching garments for pennies per piece. According to the 1900 census, they lived in a tenement building at 1247 Chester Street with 14 other Italian immigrant families, sharing communal toilets and a single water pump in the courtyard. The building still existed in 2024, converted into expensive loft apartments, but city records preserved photographs from a 1932 tenement survey showing its original condition. Crumbling brick facade, broken windows, fire escapes crowded with laundry, and sleeping children escaping the summer heat. The living conditions had been brutal, overcrowded, unsanitary, dangerous. David could understand why wealthy families might have looked at children living in such poverty and convinced themselves they were rescuing them by taking them into their comfortable homes. But the note in Maria's hand, the terror in her eyes, told a very different story. Margaret found more notices in L'Opinione over the following months. Giuseppe and Francesca had continued searching for Maria, placing ads every few weeks through the fall of 1903. "Still searching for our daughter Maria. Please, if anyone knows anything, we have not stopped looking for our little girl. We miss her every day. Please help us." By early 1904, the notices stopped appearing. David searched death records, wondering if the parents had died or given up hope. What he found was worse. Giuseppe and Francesca Rossi had returned to Italy in March 1904, according to ship passenger manifests. They had abandoned their search and gone home. "They probably had no choice," Margaret said sadly. "They couldn't afford to keep living here and searching. They had no money, no connections, no way to fight powerful people if someone from a wealthy family had taken their daughter. So they left, probably assuming Maria was dead." David felt anger rising in his chest. But she wasn't dead. She was living less than 2 miles away from them, in the Morrison household, probably being told she should be grateful, that she'd been saved from poverty, that her real parents had abandoned her. He pulled up the 1910 census record for Maria again. She would have been 12 years old by then. The listing showed her still living with the Morrisons, now described as adopted daughter and attending school. On paper, it looked like a success story, a poor immigrant child given opportunities she never would have had otherwise. But David couldn't stop thinking about that note, about the 5-year-old girl desperate enough to hide a message asking for help during a family photograph. David decided to research Morrison & Webb Photography Studio more thoroughly, hoping to find something that might reveal what had happened during that 1904 portrait session. The Philadelphia Historical Commission had archived records from dozens of defunct photography studios, including business ledgers, appointment books, and correspondence. What he found in the Morrison & Webb collection was extraordinary. A leather journal kept by James Webb, the junior partner in the studio, containing notes about particularly memorable photography sessions from 1902 to 1907. Most entries were brief professional observations, lighting techniques used, difficult clients, successful compositions. But one entry from August 1904 was longer and more personal. Photographed the Edward Morrison family today. 4 sons, well-behaved. Also a young girl, perhaps 5 or 6, whom they claimed was recently adopted. The child appeared frightened throughout the session and would not smile despite Mrs. Morrison's increasingly sharp insistence. Mr. Morrison grew irritated with the girl's demeanor. I noticed she kept her hands clasped tightly together and seemed to be hiding something, but I did not press the matter as Mr. Morrison is an important client. The sitting took nearly an hour due to the child's inability to remain composed. I have misgivings about this family's treatment of the girl, but it is not my place to question my client's domestic arrangements. Still, something about the child's eyes troubles me. She looked at me as though begging for help, and I did nothing. David read the passage 3 times, feeling the weight of James Webb's guilt across 120 years. The photographer had seen Maria's distress, had noticed her clutching something in her hands, had recognized that something was wrong, and had done nothing because the Morrisons were wealthy clients whose business he couldn't afford to lose. But Webb's conscience had troubled him enough to record his observations, creating the only contemporary documentation of Maria's state of mind during that photograph session. Margaret had been researching the Morrison family's social connections and found something equally disturbing. Clara Morrison, Edward's wife, had been active in several women's charitable organizations focused on rescuing immigrant children from poverty. She sat on the board of the Philadelphia Society for Orphan Children and had written letters to newspapers advocating for wealthy families to take in poor children to save them from the degradation of tenement life. She genuinely believed she was helping these children, Margaret said. The ideology of the time taught wealthy people that poverty was a moral failing, that immigrant families were unfit to raise their own children, and that removing children from their parents and placing them with better families was charitable work. But Maria wasn't an orphan, David said bitterly. She had parents who loved her and were desperate to find her. The Morrisons stole someone's child and convinced themselves it was a good deed. They still didn't know exactly how Maria had been taken, but the pattern was becoming clear. She had disappeared from outside her family's tenement building in June 1903. Within a year, she was living with the Morrison family, who claimed to have adopted her despite no legal paperwork. And she had been terrified enough to hide a note begging for help during a family photograph. David searched for what had happened to Maria after 1910, hoping to find evidence that she had eventually escaped or reconnected with her birth family. What he found was more ambiguous and, in some ways, more troubling. The 1920 census showed Maria Rossi, now aged 22, still living with the Morrison family and working as a domestic servant in their household. She was no longer listed as an adopted daughter, but as an employee, suggesting that whatever pretense of family relationship had existed in her childhood had been abandoned. By 1930, Maria had moved out. City directories listed her living in a boarding house on Chestnut Street and working as a seamstress in a garment factory, the same kind of low-wage work her mother Francesca had done. David found her marriage record from 1932. Maria Rossi married Antonio De Luca, a construction worker at St. Mary Magdalene de Pazzi Church, the same church her parents had contacted when she first disappeared in 1903. She had returned to the Italian immigrant community, suggesting she had never forgotten her origins despite being raised by the Morrison family. The 1940 census showed Maria and Antonio living in South Philadelphia with their 3 children, all born in the 1930s. Antonio's occupation was listed as laborer, Maria's as housewife. They lived modestly, probably struggling financially, but they had built a life together. Maria died in 1968 at age 70, according to her death certificate. She was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yadon, a cemetery popular with Philadelphia's Italian-American community. But David could find no evidence that she had ever reconnected with her birth parents or learned what had happened to them. Giuseppe and Francesca Rossi had returned to Italy in 1904, and David could find no record of them ever coming back to America or of Maria traveling to Italy to find them. She had spent her childhood stolen from her family, raised by people who had taken her against her will, and she had never been reunited with the parents who had searched desperately for her. The note she had hidden in the photograph, her attempt to leave a clue, to ask for help, had gone unnoticed for over a century. Margaret found one more document that brought tears to both their eyes, a 1945 naturalization petition filed by Maria De Luca, formerly Rossi. In the section asking for her birthplace, she had written, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, daughter of Giuseppe and Francesca Rossi. Even after 40 years, even though she had probably never seen her parents again, she had claimed them publicly in an official document. She had remembered who she was and where she had come from. She never forgot, Margaret whispered, reading the petition. Despite everything the Morrisons did, she never forgot her real family. David decided the story needed to be told publicly. He wrote a detailed research report documenting everything he and Margaret had discovered. Maria's disappearance in 1903, her forced placement with the Morrison family, the hidden note in the photograph, James Webb's journal entry, and Maria's later life. He contacted the Philadelphia Inquirer, which published the story with the photograph prominently displayed. The article ran on a Sunday in September 2024. Hidden message in 120-year-old photo reveals child trafficking in Philadelphia's Gilded Age. The response was immediate and overwhelming. David received hundreds of emails from people moved by Maria's story, from historians studying child welfare in the early 20th century, from genealogists researching similar cases. Several readers pointed out that Maria's story was not unique. Thousands of immigrant children had been taken from poor families and placed with wealthy ones under various pretexts during that era. But the most important email came from a woman named Isabella Romano in South Philadelphia. I think Maria Rossi De Luca was my great-grandmother, she wrote. My grandmother was Maria's youngest daughter, born in 1939. She died 10 years ago, but she used to tell us stories about her mother, how she had been taken from her family as a child and raised by strangers, how she had tried to find her birth parents but never succeeded. My grandmother said Maria never talked much about it because it was too painful, but she kept a small photograph of herself as a child that she looked at sometimes and cried. Could this be the same photograph? David called Isabella immediately. She was a high school teacher, 52 years old, and she had never heard the full story of her great-grandmother's childhood. My grandmother told us that Maria's parents were Giuseppe and Francesca Rossi, and that they had come from Italy, Isabella explained. She said Maria had been kidnapped or stolen somehow when she was very young, and that her parents had gone back to Italy without her. But we never knew the details: who took her, where she lived, what happened to her. Maria died when I was only 6 years old, so I never got to ask her. David sent Isabella all his research, including the enhanced photographs showing the note in Maria's hand. When she called back 2 days later, she was crying. I showed the photograph to my mother, who's 83, Isabella said. She recognized it immediately. She said Maria had kept a copy of this exact photograph her entire life, hidden in a drawer with her other important papers. After Maria died, the family found it, but we never understood why she had kept a picture that showed her looking so frightened and sad. Now we know. It was evidence. She kept it as proof of what had been done to her. Isabella asked if she could visit the Genealogical Society to see the original photograph and learn more about her great-grandmother's story. Isabella Romano stood in David's office at the Philadelphia Genealogical Society, staring at the original 1904 photograph through protective glass. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at her great-grandmother, 5 years old and terrified, clutching a desperate plea for help that no one had seen for 120 years. She was so small, Isabella whispered. Just a baby, really. And she was brave enough to write that note and hide it in her hand, hoping someone would notice and help her. But no one did. David had prepared a complete dossier for Isabella, copies of all the records he had found, the timeline of Maria's life, the enhanced photographs showing the note's visible text, James Webb's journal entry, the newspaper notices Giuseppe and Francesca had placed searching for their daughter. It was a complete documentation of a child stolen from her family and the lifetime of loss that followed. I want to tell her story, Isabella said firmly. Maria couldn't find her parents, and her parents never found her. But she had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and we can make sure people know what happened to her. We can give her voice back. Over the next 3 months, Isabella worked with David and Margaret to create a comprehensive exhibit at the Philadelphia Immigration History Center. Maria's Story: Child Trafficking and Exploitation in Gilded Age Philadelphia. The exhibit centered on the 1904 photograph, with the enhanced images showing the hidden note displayed prominently alongside Maria's life story. But the exhibit also contextualized Maria's experience within the broader history of child exploitation in early 20th century America. David had found records of dozens of similar cases: poor immigrant children who disappeared from their families and reappeared in wealthy households, claimed as adoptions that had no legal foundation, often working as unpaid servants under the guise of being family members. The exhibit included testimonies from descendants of other stolen children, historical documents about the child-saving movement that had justified removing children from immigrant and poor families, and information about the lack of child welfare protections during that era. On opening day, over 300 people attended. Many were descendants of Italian immigrants who shared their own family stories of children lost to exploitation or suspicious adoptions. Several historians gave presentations about child welfare history and the evolution of adoption laws. Isabella stood beside the photograph of her great-grandmother and spoke about Maria's life, how she had been stolen at age 5, raised by strangers who treated her as a servant, and had managed despite everything to build a life for herself in the Italian community that the Morrisons had tried to separate her from. Maria never got to go home, Isabella said, her voice breaking. She never saw her parents again, never got to tell them she hadn't forgotten them, never got justice for what was done to her. But she survived. She married, she had children, she worked hard, and she held on to her identity as Giuseppe and Francesca Rossi's daughter. And now, finally, people know her story. That note she held in her hand in 1904, asking for help. It's finally been seen. It's finally been answered, even if it took 120 years. David watched as visitors stood silently before the photograph, reading about Maria's life, seeing the enhanced images of the note she had hidden. Many wept. Many asked questions about how such things could have happened, how families could steal children and face no consequences. The exhibit remained open for 6 months and was visited by over 15,000 people. It was featured in national news coverage about historical child exploitation and the evolution of adoption and child welfare systems. Several universities requested permission to use the materials in teaching about immigration history and child welfare. But perhaps most importantly, Maria's story inspired descendants of other stolen children to come forward with their own family histories. David began receiving messages from people across the country who had family stories about children who disappeared or were suspiciously adopted during the early 1900s, and he started documenting these cases, building a database of stolen childhoods finally being acknowledged. One evening, after the exhibit had closed, David stood alone before the photograph of Maria Rossi, looking at her small, frightened face and the note clutched desperately in her hands. "They see you now," he said quietly. "Everyone can see what you were trying to tell them. You're not forgotten, Maria. You're remembered." And in the silence of the gallery, surrounded by the documented evidence of her stolen childhood and her resilient life, David felt that somehow, across the vast distance of 120 years, Maria Rossi would have been grateful that her silent plea had finally been heard, her truth finally acknowledged, and her existence finally honored as it should have been from the very beginning. The photograph that had preserved her desperate message had also preserved her dignity, her courage, and her unbreakable connection to the family that had loved her and lost her. And now, no one would ever forget her again.